So, anyway, we'll try to do a complex subject, some justice in a brief span of time. I'll make some introductory comments, and then I'd be happy to take questions. And you know, don't be shy. If something is on your mind or something you think that you may be hard put to respond to a question on a specific issue, just raise it. Had we met 2 or 3 weeks ago, the comments would have been slightly different. Egypt and the wave of unrest that has affected the region in the past few weeks would not have been uppermost. If I were to speak about the 5 major issues that shape the current scene in the Middle East, I would have mentioned the danger of instability as one of them. In 1993, in the middle of for the peace process of the 1990s, Shimon Peres, who was then the foreign minister in the Israeli government, published a book called The New Middle East. The book was a vision of a new Middle East, different from the old Middle East. And the main thesis of the book was that the real issues facing the Middle East are not political, but social and economic. That the Middle East is bound to be affected by instability because of the discrepancy between population and resources. And what Shimon Peres argued in the book was that Israelis and Arabs should patch up their political differences and collaborate together in building infrastructure, in creating the workspace, the potential for employment for the population of the Middle East that was growing at an alarming pace. The Middle East now has more than the Arab world, not counting Iran and Turkey, has more than 300 million people. And in less than a generation, there would be 400 million Arabs. And there are about 80 million Turks and about close to 80 million Iranians. Iran and Turkey do not face the same problems that the Arab world does, because they are, in economic terms, doing much better than the Arab world. Turkey is the 15th economy in the world, and Iran has oil and gas, and if it has better leadership than it does now and invests in development rather than developing unappealing stuff, it would be much better economically. But the Arab world has a problem. How do you feed more than 300 million people? What do you do with a population structure where 60% are young people, where most university graduates in a country like Egypt have no employment, have no prospect of decent housing, don't even have the money in order to get married, and look at the very dim future. So the main problem is instability. You cannot have political stability where you have an underpinning of social and economic unrest. Part of it is resolved for the Middle East by emigration or immigration to Europe, but Europeans are becoming alarmed by the ratio of Muslims in the populations and are going to close the gates. You may have noticed that in countries like Holland and Denmark, right-wing governments have been elected. The main issue is the Muslim immigration, the growing percentage of Muslims in the population of these countries. It generates a right-wing, conservative, even sometimes fascist reaction, and many of these gates are going to be closed. Europe does not want to admit Turkey into the European Union, because if you talk frankly to a Frenchman or to a German, they would say, we don't need another 80 million Muslims in Europe, we have enough. But of course, by blocking the gates to Europe, to Turkey, Turkey is looking for a different environment, a different outlook, and rediscovered the Middle East, and has now turned to the Middle East and has added to the problems of the Middle East, because Turkey now has an Islamist government, a different government from other Islamist governments. It has found a formula for a more or less democratic government, flourishing economy, and an Islamist regime. It may be a model for other countries, but in terms of Middle Eastern politics, it has not been a positive influence because it has reinforced the radical camp in the Middle East. So what is shaping the Middle East? First of all, America's weakness. There is no Cold War. America does not defend countries like Turkey from the Soviet threat that was there for most of the second half of the 20th century. And people feel free, they are not as dependent on America. America itself is weaker economically and politically. It does not have the same ability to project, Shalom Ida, as it did in previous decades. And America has a different leadership. President Obama belongs to a different generation. He's younger, he grew up in a different environment. His ideas about the world are different. He wants to engage, and when America wants to engage with regimes like the Iranian regime or the Syrian regime, there's a problem, because there's a certain degree of naivety in that approach that wants to engage. And when you try to engage with cynical dictatorial regimes like the Iranian or the Syrian regime, the results are not very happy. Look at Lebanon. Lebanon is a victim of that. In 2005, you may remember, the moderate wing in Lebanese politics won the elections. The same Saad Hariri, who's just been thrown away from power. Fouad Senora was the leader of the Sunni camp. They won the elections. They forced the Syrians out after the assassination of Saad Hariri's father, and it seemed that Lebanon was on a road to democracy and stability. It had the backing of President Bush at the time. It does not have the backing of President Obama, and the Iranians and the Syrians reversed the trend in Lebanon, and Lebanon is slowly but surely coming under the influence of Hezbollah, and is going to become another country dominated by the Shia. Perhaps the single most important element in the Middle Eastern picture is the rise of Iran. Now, we normally think about Iran mostly in terms of nuclear weapons. The Iranian quest for building nuclear weapons and the ability to dispatch them, either with missiles or with airplanes, to become a nuclear power. I should stress, the Iranian nuclear program has not been conceived against Israel. Iran wants nuclear weapons because it wants to be a major power. Iran is a successor state to a former empire. It has imperial ambitions. It wants to be a major power on the international stage. It certainly wants to be the dominant power in the Middle East, a hegemonial power in the Middle East. It looks east and west. It sees nuclear weapons in India, in Pakistan, suspects that Israel has nuclear weapons. We don't, as you know, our policy, and if you ask about it, is nuclear ambiguity. And if people ask you about the Israeli nuclear program, you should say, we have lived very well with nuclear ambiguity for quite a few years, and we'd like to continue to do that. So, but of course the Iranians assume that we have nuclear weapons, and lots of them, and they think that in order to be the hegemonial power in the Middle East, they need to be a nuclear power. This is what the present regime thinks. But it does not end there. Iran wants to be the dominant power in the Gulf. It wants to turn the Gulf producing, oil producing states into clients, maybe even to take over some of them. Bahrain is the closest, but what Saddam did in Kuwait they may do in other places, but under a nuclear umbrella. The Iranians look at North Korea, and they see a country that acquired immunity because, Ambassador may correct me on this, the world assumes that they have at least 3 or 4 nuclear bombs, maybe more, and of course the cost of a military attack on North Korea may be devastating for South Korea and other neighboring countries. So the Iranians look at that and say, well, the North Koreans played games with the Americans, they made a deal with President Clinton, they didn't keep it, they played around, they went through a diplomacy of lies and playing for time, and they ended up buying themselves nuclear immunity. Why don't we do the same? If Iran has a nuclear umbrella, it doesn't have to use the nuclear weapon. It would just do what it's doing now, but more so. It may invade countries in the Gulf, or it may encourage Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza to be more provocative vis-a-vis Israel. And I personally would not want to be in the shoes of an Israeli prime minister who faces a provocation by Hezbollah and contemplates a response, and then hears that Ahmadinejad said, Iran will stand by its allies and friends in Lebanon with everything it has. Do you want to be the Israeli prime minister who decides to act in Lebanon as Olmert did in 2006? Nor do I want to be in the shoes of the Israeli prime minister who needs to make a decision now, that if the world is not doing much about Iran, the sanctions are not very effective, President Obama is not likely to launch a military attack, do I want to be the Israeli prime minister on whose watch Iran went nuclear? Or do I want to be the Israeli prime minister who launched a preemptive strike on Iran that may or may not be successful, that would exact a terrible price from Israel? A very difficult choice for an Israeli prime minister. As the late as the ailing Ariel Sharon used to say, this is the world's toughest job, but I don't see a very short line of people who want to replace me in that tough job. So Iran still is the number one problem in this region. We spoke earlier about the dichotomy, the tension between stability and the quest for democracy in the region. That is not going to go away. There's going to be pressure for more participation, in some cases for more liberty. There is a great deal of unhappiness with regimes that are dictatorial and corrupt, and this is going to be part of the picture. Egypt is not the last country to witness instability. Jordan is under pressure. At some point, Saudi Arabia may give way, and so forth and so forth. So we just have to anticipate that instability is going to be part of the picture. People are going, and that's, by the way, a question that you may encounter. The Arab-Israeli conflict is the major cause of instability because people are anti-Western or people are unhappy because of the Palestinian problem. Now, the answer is, of course, that analytically this is not true. We also notice, happily at this point, that we do not figure out in the demonstrations in Cairo. These are not anti-Israeli demonstrations. The demonstrators are unhappy with the regime, with corruption, with the lack of liberty, and so forth and so forth. Of course, they may not be the most enthusiastic supporters of peace with Israel, but this is not the main concern. Our preoccupation is that this may all end up in Muslim Brotherhood participation in the government, and we know what the attitude of the Muslim Brotherhood is towards Israel and peace with Israel. But at this point, it's not an issue. But, of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the only and not the most important source of instability or criticism of or hatred of the West in the Middle East, but it's part of the picture. And therefore, it is in our interest to resolve it. Now, this, of course, is a political issue in this country. The country is deeply divided, has been since 1967, on what what we need to do in order to achieve peace. I mean, achieving peace is a consensus, but are you willing to make far-reaching concessions in order to do that? I'm not going to tell you, what your outlook on this should be. This is the personal political decision of each of us. But I think that there is a majority in this country that understands that you do not achieve peace without concessions, that the idea of peace for peace is not practical. And agree. The question is to what extent you're willing to make the concessions, and to what an extent you are willing to take risks. For instance, take what is happening in Egypt now, a very serious issue. After 33 years of peace, a government may come to power in Egypt that may not respect the peace with Israel, and the people who are against concessions would say, well, Menachem Begin gave up the whole of the Sinai in return for a peace treaty with Egypt, and look at the result. 33 years later, there's a question mark. You can explain to people who talk to you that there are two difficulties in every peace process for Israelis. We give tangibles for intangibles. Tangibles, territory; intangible is a piece of paper. Piece of paper can be revoked at any time. Look at what happened in the Palestinian community. We signed the Oslo Accords, we recognized the PLO, we allowed Yasser Arafat to come back from Tunis and establish the Palestinian Authority. Then in 2006 there were free elections in the Palestinian community. Hamas won. They do not respect the Oslo Accords. They don't recognize them. So we gave back a tangible. We withdrew from parts of the West Bank. We left Gaza unilaterally, and we got an intangible, the Oslo Accord. And the second part of it is we give back irreversibles and we get back reversibles. Irreversible is a withdrawal. You withdrew. It's not that easy to come back. Look at what happened in Gaza. They start shelling us. We went back into Gaza, Operation Cast Lead. Look at the wave of international criticism that we generated by going back into Gaza to accomplish something quite legitimate, to get Hamas to stop shelling or launching rockets at Israeli towns and cities. And yet, when we tried to reverse something that we did, we got criticized badly, and what we get is easily reversible. A recognition, an agreement, then a piece of paper, an oral statement that can be undone. So the Arab-Israeli peace process is now in one of its weakest points. It flourished in the 1990s. There were then hopes that we could resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. There were ups and downs. Right now we are at a down. When you asked about Israeli politics, you can say the following. The Israeli public was quite dovish in 2006. It voted into power Ehud Olmert, the head of Kadima, on the platform of continuing Sharon's policy of withdrawal, unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. That was the platform on which Ehud Olmert was elected prime minister in 2006. In the elections of 2009, 10, was a different story, because at that point we had Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran doing what it's doing in Iran. The Israeli public is scared, and when people are scared, when people are in panic, they turn to the right. So the Israeli public is responding to developments beyond its control. So to wrap it up and move on to your questions, the Middle East is going through a bad period. The international system, as represented by U.S. leadership, is in a weak position. Russia is making a beginning of a comeback to the Middle East, mostly by supporting people like the Syrians and Hamas, or by providing sophisticated weapon systems mostly to Syria. China will be more influential, and China is totally indifferent to these issues. It has no history in this region. It does not share in what we call the Judeo-Christian heritage. It's going, when China translates economic position to political influence, it's going to be a different state of affairs. In regional terms, Iran's quest for hegemony is destabilizing, the social and economic unrest is destabilizing, and the Arab-Israeli peace process is in a bad state. So altogether, this is not a happy time in the Middle East, and if you are lucky with technology, you are less lucky to talk to you about politics. So let's now take a few questions. As I said, I invite you to raise the most difficult issues, please.
This may sound a bit provocative, but it's not. Many of these analyses assume stability in Israel, like democratic forever and everything is the same, which in practice may not be the case in current trends. And we may have some reference on such issues, what happens with changes that might happen in this country as well.
Well, first of all, you speak about might. It's the hypothetical potential in the future. I'm not worried about the strength of Israeli democracy. You know, we have our problems, but look at the way we overcome the problems. Look at the preponderance of the legal system. We just now, this week, went through a very unsettling episode in civil-military relations, and at the end, logic and the system triumph. Look even at corruption, something that bothers us. Compare us to France and Italy. In Italy and in France, very corrupt politicians who are prime ministers and finance ministers and so forth walk home freely at the end of the tenure. And here they don't. So I'm not fundamentally worried about the health of the Israeli democracy. Yes, please.
I was asked about, well, not asked, but people just told me that Israel is a racist country with regards to its relation to Arabs who live in Israel. I mean, Israeli Arabs.
Right.
Well, I said that it's not true, but I said, well, that is true.
Well, during World War II, when the United States fought against Japan, the United States put American citizens of Japanese origins in concentration camps. You may or may not be aware of that, but that's a fact. Now, that's not a great thing to do, but it gives you some perspective that we are in conflict with Hamas in Gaza. We are in conflict with parts of the Arab world. We have an Arab minority of 20%, has full political rights, represented in the Knesset, is free to engage in anti-Israeli hostilities. On the board of Abi Mama, the Turkish ship that went to Gaza, was Hanin Zoabi, an Arab member of the Knesset and the leader of the Islamist movement in Israel. People like Taleb Hasana or Ahmad Tibi and so forth appear on Israel radio and television and criticize, and say, impolitely, the state of Israel. I'm not saying that there is full social equality in Israel. Israel needs to deal with the problem of the Arab minority. It cannot do it fully before the larger Palestinian question is resolved, because Israeli Arabs now see themselves as Palestinians. You used to say 30, 40 years ago, Israeli Arabs. They don't use the term for themselves anymore. Say, we are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. And so that, given the severity of the challenge, I think Israel can be quite proud of the level of political participation and civic liberties that Israeli Arabs have. Now look at a very simple issue. There is discussion of what happens if there is a Palestinian state and we have a swap. We say that in order to keep 80% of the settlers in place. We need about 5% of the West Bank, and we'll give the future Palestinian state 5% of a swap. Some people like Mr. Lieberman and others say, well, why give them Chalutza in the Negev or another area? Let's give them Wadi Ara. And the first people who object to that are the people who live in Wadi Ara. They want to remain Israeli citizens. If it was so bad to be an Arab in Israel, why wouldn't they want to be full-fledged Palestinians and a Palestinian state? They know it's a better place to live in. So I know the charge is being made, but I think you can defend the state of Israel against that charge quite easily. Is that the most provocative you can get? Yes, please.
Your general overview described a pretty gloomy situation. So where is the hope?
Well, when I speak abroad, I say that the hope is in Israeli high-tech industry. No, it's. I think Israel itself, I mean, is an immense success story. You look at what was here 60 years ago, about 1 million people, very poor, basically nothing. And what you have here in terms of a flourishing country, flourishing high-tech industry, system of higher education, scientific research, a wonderful cultural life that you have in Israel. It's an immense success story. Unfortunately, Israel finds itself in an uninviting environment. It has to deal with that. And you look at a good analogy would be to, when you talk to people, say, look at what happened in Europe in 1989, 1990. It was the Berlin Wall and it fell, and things changed dramatically overnight. Because by and large, East European countries who had traditions of parliamentary democracy went democratic. Look at Poland, Czech Republic, lesser extent, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, but on the whole, Eastern Europe was transformed almost overnight, and you now have a different Europe. This is not going to happen in the Middle East, even if you have a series of revolutions, because the society is not ready for those kinds of regimes, and Israel needs to cope with an unfriendly environment. That is not just an Israeli problem, because not just in terms of immigration, in terms of terrorism, in terms of a nuclear threat. Ballistic missiles in Iran that have a nuclear warhead can be fired in this direction, but can also be fired in other directions. So it's a part of the world that needs to be dealt with by the whole international system, not just by us.
Professor Rabinovich, I know that you have to almost get out of here on your schedule, but just to bring this back to context, we are all going to Barcelona next week, and as Bonnie Berger from the Canadian Embassy was telling us, we are all ambassadors for Israel next week. So I want to put you in a role. You are now an Israeli high-tech representative. This is Barcelona. I'm going to do business with you. And we are having our small talk just before we start to conduct our business discussions. And I am telling you, okay, so remember, this is a small talk business discussion. We are not dealing with representing the state of Israel on a very structural basis. So I'm telling you, so what's going on with your government? Your prime minister says he wants peace. Your minister of foreign affairs says he doesn't want peace. They fight against each other. What's really going on in your country? What do you say?
Well, I would say, in terms of the politics, we are not going through a great period. We need political reform, as the electoral system needs to be reformed. People shy away from politics. The price of being in public and political life has become too high. If you look at just some recent, look at some of the people who were candidates for a position few weeks ago and what price they had to be paid for just being a candidate for a position, which means that young people who enter adult life look at other more appetizing careers that are open to them and go away from the public sector and from political life. As a result, the quality of political life has declined, and we are not in a good phase, but it's a phase. The country went through ups and downs. It had some great leaders, it had some mediocre leaders. Right now, it's not a great period for Israeli politics, but there will be other periods.
So my last question to you before we do real business here. You're talking about the instability of the political system in Israel. You're talking about the Iranian threats. You're talking about the instability in Egypt. Should I even consider doing business with an Israeli company, you being representative of a very sophisticated situation in the Middle East?
Yes, there's no need to worry about that, because compared to what we went through in the early years of the previous decade, between 2000 and 2003, we are now living in a paradise. Don't have to elaborate, but we remember what happened here during the Second Intifada and the suicide bombing and so forth. Israeli high-tech continued to produce. Israeli industry was not affected in any major way. Anyone who made an investment, who bought into an Israeli company and so forth, did not regret it. Look at Warren Buffett. He's not a minor businessman. One of his largest investments was made in a very sophisticated Israeli company. So if it's good enough for Warren Buffett, it's good for you.